law which requires that a drug is subject of an approved marketing application before it's transported or distributed across state lines. So that requires going through the phase 1, 2, 3 process and getting a biological license approval. The FDA, the IND process is the means through which a sponsor can technically obtain exemptions from the FDA, because obviously if the clinical trials involve multiple clinical sites and you need to ship across state lines, you need an exemption. So the drug's early preclinical development, the sponsor's primary goal obviously is to determine that the product's safe for initial use in humans and exhibits pharmacological activity. Obviously, that's a business aspect. The sponsor's going to need to have activity before moving forward with the commercial development. When the sponsor's focusing on collecting data and information, it's necessary to establish that the product is safe and won't expose humans to unreasonable risks when used in limited early stage clinical studies. And the FDA's role really begins when the drug sponsor has screened the molecule for the activity and has undertaken animal studies to determine if there's acute toxicities. And so they want to move forward and test it in its diagnostic or therapeutic potential in humans. So at that point, the product changes its legal status under the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act and becomes a new drug subject to specific requirements of the drug regulatory system. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the 361 and 351 aspects. So these are two categories that the FDA has in place for regulating drugs and cellular products. A number of products are regulated solely under the 361. There's no pre-market review or no application to the FDA is required, and compliance is determined at an FDA inspection level. And examples of this are minimally manipulated cellular therapies, and one of these is bone marrow for bone marrow transplantation. The criteria for regulation solely under the 361 is summarized in this slide, and they're detailed in 21 CFR Part 1271.10. This act requires that a 361 product is minimally manipulated. It's intended for homologous use. It's not combined with any other article, and no systemic effect, and not dependent on metabolic activity of living cells. Exceptions are autologous use in a first or second degree blood relative, or reproductive use, and we'll discuss more examples moving forward. 351 products, pre-market review and approval is required. It's either a BLA for biological products, an NDA for a drug, or an IDE, PMA, or 510K for devices. And a 351 is regulated by the fact that it does not meet one or more of the criteria in 1271.10, so it does not qualify as a 361 product. It requires a pre-license approval and an inspection approval. Examples of this would be cellular therapies for unrelated allogeneic use. In terms of INDs, there's there's different categories of INDs. An investigator IND can be submitted by a physician who both initiates and conducts an investigation, and under whose immediate direction the investigational drug is administered or dispensed. Corporate sponsored INDs, obviously, they depend upon having an investigator at a hospital or academic institution or some other physician entity. They are the sponsor, and the physician is the primary investigator. There's a couple of other types of INDs, for example, emergency use INDs. This is used obviously by the name in emergency situations. It's sometimes also used for patients who might not meet the criteria of an existing study protocol, or if an approved study protocol does not exist. The emergency use INDs are typically for smaller numbers of patients. Treatment INDs are also possible. These are submitted for experimental drugs which show promising clinical testing for serious or immediately life-threatening conditions. And they can be approved while the final clinical work is conducted and FDA review takes place. So again, two major categories of INDs, and those represent commercial and research. Research, non-commercial, are typically done at academic centers. But the FDA does treat them very differently, which is an interesting aspect. There's typically less oversight on academic research, non-commercial INDs. They're usually only performed at a single institute, and so typically the opportunities for adverse events is decreased. So just going through some of the aspects of investigation on a new drug, they're used in clinical investigations, must be covered by an IND. There's extensive regulations that cover the procedures and requirements for INDs. And more recently, as I mentioned up front, there's changes in IND submissions which require the ECTD format. Again, a couple of definitions. The sponsor is an individual, company, institution, organization that takes responsibility for and initiates a clinical study. The sponsor is the primary individual or entity that's held liable for the clinical studies and any adverse events that may occur. So the general responsibilities for the sponsor: they are charged with selecting qualified investigators. They ensure study monitoring. They maintain the IND, ensuring that they submit their annual reports and any other reporting that's necessary, any issues with toxicities, etc. And they ensure all adverse event risk information is provided to the FDA and investigators. The investigator is an individual under whose immediate direction the study drug is administered or dispensed. If there's a team involved, the leader is the investigator, the other team members are sub-investigators. In a number of studies where you've got multiple institutions, you would have a primary investigator who would be in charge at each institute. And again, his team members would be sub-investigators. So the investigator's responsibility are to ensure the study is conducted according to the plan. It's to protect the rights, safety, and welfare of the study subjects and control of the drug under investigation. So the sponsor and investigator have very different responsibilities, and both need to be communicating so that all aspects are covered through their performance. It is possible to have a sponsor investigator, and this would be an individual who both initiates and conducts the study and under whose immediate direction the study drug is administered or dispensed.